Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mists of time, to a world where the line between dream and reality was as thin as morning fog over the Aegean Sea. Tonight, we journey together into the heart of Renaissance Italy, to meet a man whose name has become synonymous with cunning, with power, with the cold calculations of political survival. But before we speak his name, before we open the pages of the book that would make him infamous, let us first understand the world that shaped him, the city that forged his mind like iron in a blacksmith's fire, and the tumultuous age that demanded new answers to ancient questions about how power works, how it is gained, and how it is kept. Picture, if you will, the city of Florence in the late 15th century. The sun rises over terracotta roofs and marble facades, casting long shadows through narrow streets that wind like rivers between buildings that seem to reach toward heaven itself. The air is alive with the sound of commerce, merchants calling out their wares, the ring of hammers against metal in workshops where craftsmen create beauty from raw materials, the murmur of voices in a dozen dialects as people from across Italy and beyond gather in this jewel of Tuscany. This is a city where art and learning flourish like flowers in a carefully tended garden, where the greatest minds of the age gather to discuss philosophy and poetry, where painters and sculptors create works that will inspire wonder for centuries to come. But beneath this surface of beauty and enlightenment, there flows a darker current. This is also a city of intense political intrigue, of rival families jockeying for power, of alliances that shift like sand, of fortunes made and lost in a single day. The streets that seem so peaceful in the morning light have witnessed assassinations and riots, celebrations and executions. The same hands that create magnificent frescoes might also hold daggers in the shadows. Florence is a republic, yes, but one where the reality of power often contradicts the ideals of civic virtue that are proclaimed in public squares. Into this world of contradiction and complexity was born Niccolò Machiavelli, on the 3rd of May in the year 1469. His family was old and respectable, though not particularly wealthy or powerful. His father, Bernardo, was a lawyer of modest means, a man who loved books and learning more than the pursuit of wealth. The Machiavelli household was one where education was valued, where the classics of ancient Rome and Greece were read and discussed, where the boy Niccolò learned early that knowledge could be a form of power in itself. We know relatively little about Machiavelli's childhood, but we can imagine the young boy walking through the streets of Florence, his sharp eyes taking in everything, the way people interacted, the subtle dance of deference and dominance, the masks that everyone wore in public. He would have witnessed the spectacle of Lorenzo de' Medici, called the Magnificent, who ruled Florence in all but name, maintaining the fiction of republican government while exercising princely power. Lorenzo was the very model of what would later be called a Renaissance man, a patron of the arts who surrounded himself with poets and philosophers, a shrewd politician who maintained Florence's independence through careful diplomacy and, when necessary, ruthless action. The Florence of Machiavelli's youth was the epicenter of what we now call the Renaissance, that remarkable flowering of human creativity and intellectual inquiry that marked the transition from the medieval world to something we might recognize as modern. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and it referred specifically to the rebirth of interest in the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. Scholars were rediscovering ancient texts that had been lost or forgotten for centuries, translating them from Greek and Latin, finding in them ideas about politics, ethics, art, and science that seemed to speak directly to their own age. But this was not simply a nostalgic looking backward. The thinkers of the Renaissance were using the wisdom of the ancients as a foundation for new ideas, new ways of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. They were beginning to shift away from the medieval worldview that placed God and the afterlife at the center of all concern, and toward a more human-centered philosophy that celebrated the achievements and potential of mortal men and women. This movement, which we call humanism, emphasized the study of classical literature, rhetoric, history, and moral philosophy as the proper education for citizens and leaders. Machiavelli's education was thoroughly grounded in this humanist tradition. He learned Latin, the language of learning and diplomacy, and immersed himself in the works of ancient Roman historians like Livy, Tacitus, and Sallust. These writers told stories of how Rome had grown from a small city to a mighty empire, how leaders like Julius Caesar and Augustus had wielded power, how republics rose and fell. Young Niccolò read these histories not as dusty accounts of a distant past, but as living guides to understanding the political realities of his own time. The names and places might differ, but human nature, he would come to believe, remained constant across the centuries. He also studied the political philosophers of antiquity, particularly Aristotle and Cicero, who had written extensively about the nature of good government, the virtues required of citizens and leaders, and the different forms that states could take. These classical thinkers emphasized moral virtue as the foundation of political life. They taught that the good ruler should be wise, just, temperate, and courageous, that leadership was fundamentally about ethical excellence. This was the conventional wisdom that Machiavelli absorbed in his youth, the standard against which political action was judged in polite society. But Machiavelli was also learning other lessons from observation and experience. He saw how Lorenzo the Magnificent maintained power not through virtue alone, but through a complex web of patronage, manipulation, and when necessary, violence. He witnessed the fragility of political order, how quickly circumstances could change, how the most powerful could fall and the lowly could rise if they understood the mechanisms of power and were willing to act decisively. In 1492, when Machiavelli was 23 years old, two events shook the foundations of his world. First, Lorenzo de' Medici died, leaving Florence in the hands of his less capable son Piero. And second, Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage across the Atlantic, bringing news of a new world that would soon transform European politics and economics in ways no one could yet imagine. The old order was passing, and the future was uncertain. The following year brought even more dramatic changes. King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy with a massive army, beginning a series of Italian wars that would devastate the peninsula for decades. These wars were not like the relatively small-scale conflicts between Italian city-states that had characterized earlier periods. This was something new and terrible: large professional armies with modern artillery, foreign powers treating Italy as a chessboard for their ambitions, violence on a scale that horrified those who witnessed it. Florence, caught in the path of this invasion, faced a crisis. Piero de' Medici attempted to negotiate with the French king, but his concessions were seen as cowardly and treasonous by the Florentine people. In November of 1494, a mob rose up and expelled the Medici family from the city, ending 60 years of their dominance. The Republic was restored, but Florence was now vulnerable, without the diplomatic skill and military resources that the Medici had commanded. Into this power vacuum stepped a most unlikely figure, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. This austere preacher had been warning for years that God's judgment was coming to punish Florence for its sins of luxury and corruption. The French invasion seemed to validate his prophecies, and the frightened people turned to him as a prophet and reformer. For 4 years, Savonarola effectively ruled Florence as a theocracy, demanding moral reformation, organizing the famous Bonfire of the Vanities, where books, artworks, and luxury goods were burned as sinful, and attempting to make Florence a Christian republic that would serve as an example to all of Italy. Machiavelli watched this spectacle with fascination and, one suspects, a certain skepticism. Here was a man with no army, no wealth, no traditional source of power, who nonetheless dominated one of Italy's greatest cities through the force of his words and the religious fervor he inspired. But Machiavelli also noted how Savonarola's power rested on an unstable foundation. When the mood of the people shifted, when his prophecies failed to materialize, when the Pope excommunicated him and demanded his arrest, the friar had no resources to fall back on. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, hanged, and burned in the same square where he had held his bonfires. The crowd that had once worshipped him as a prophet now watched his execution with the same enthusiasm they had shown for his sermons. This was the year that Machiavelli, at the age of 29, entered public service. The restored Republican government appointed him to the important post of Second Chancellor and Secretary to the Ten of War, a position that gave him responsibility for diplomatic correspondence and military affairs. This was not the highest office in Florence, but it placed Machiavelli at the center of the city's political life, privy to its secrets, involved in its most sensitive negotiations. For the next 14 years, Machiavelli served the Florentine Republic with dedication and skill. He conducted more than 20 diplomatic missions to various Italian states and foreign powers, negotiating alliances, gathering intelligence, observing how different rulers exercised power. He wrote countless letters and reports, analyzing political situations with a clarity and precision that his superiors valued. He worked to reform Florence's military system, convinced that reliance on mercenary soldiers was a fundamental weakness. And all the while, he was learning, watching, thinking, developing the ideas that would eventually be distilled into his most famous work. Let us follow Machiavelli on some of these diplomatic missions, for they shaped his political thought in profound ways. In 1500, he traveled to France to negotiate with King Louis XII, seeking French support for Florence against its enemies. At the French court, Machiavelli saw power on a scale that dwarfed anything in Italy. France was a unified kingdom with a strong monarchy, professional armies, and resources that made Italian city-states look like children playing at politics. He observed how Louis XII commanded absolute obedience, how the French nobility served the crown without question, how the king's will was law throughout his realm. But Machiavelli also noted weaknesses in the French system. The king was surrounded by flatterers who told him what he wanted to hear rather than uncomfortable truths. French ambitions in Italy were undermined by poor intelligence and wishful thinking. The very centralization of power that made France strong also made it inflexible, unable to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. These observations would later inform Machiavelli's advice about how princes should gather information and make decisions. Even more influential were Machiavelli's encounters with Cesare Borgia, the notorious son of Pope Alexander VI. In 1502, Machiavelli spent several months at Cesari's court in the Romagna region of central Italy, observing a master of power politics at work. Cesare Borgia was everything the conventional moralists condemned: ruthless, treacherous, willing to use any means to achieve his ends. He murdered rivals, broke promises, employed fraud and force with equal facility. And yet, Machiavelli had to admit, Cesare was remarkably effective. In just a few years, he had carved out a principality from the chaos of central Italy, bringing order to regions that had known only violence and anarchy. Machiavelli watched Cesare with the fascination of a naturalist studying a rare and dangerous animal. He saw how Cesare inspired both fear and loyalty, how he understood the importance of appearing decisive and strong, how he eliminated threats before they could grow dangerous. One incident particularly impressed Machiavelli. When Cesare conquered the town of Senigallia, he invited 4 potential rivals to a meeting, promising them reconciliation and partnership. When they arrived, he had them arrested and executed. It was treacherous, certainly, but it secured his power and prevented future conflicts. Machiavelli noted it all in his dispatches, without the moral condemnation that might have been expected from a representative of Christian Florence. He also witnessed Cesari's most notorious act of political theater. The people of the Romagna had complained about the harsh rule of Cesari's governor, Ramiro de Orco. Cesare needed to maintain order but also to appear just and responsive to his subjects. His solution was elegant and terrible. One December morning, the people of Cesena found Ramiro's body in the town square, cut in two, with a wooden block and bloody knife beside it. The message was clear: Cesare punished those who oppressed the people, but he also demonstrated his power to deal sudden and terrible justice. Machiavelli observed how this single act both satisfied the people and reinforced Cesari's reputation for decisiveness. Yet Machiavelli also recognized the limitations of Cesari's power. It rested ultimately on his father's position as pope, which gave him resources and protection. When Alexander VI died suddenly in 1503, and his enemy Giuliano della Rovere became Pope Julius II, Cesari's fortune collapsed almost overnight. Within months, the man who had seemed poised to become the master of Italy was imprisoned, stripped of his territories, and reduced to insignificance. He died a few years later, still a young man, fighting as a mercenary in a minor Spanish conflict. This dramatic reversal taught Machiavelli a crucial lesson about fortune and virtue. Cesare had possessed virtue, that combination of skill, courage, and ruthlessness that Machiavelli admired in leaders. But he had also been vulnerable to fortuna, the unpredictable force of chance and circumstance that could overturn the best-laid plans. The truly successful prince, Machiavelli concluded, must have virtue sufficient to master fortune as much as humanly possible, must build power on foundations secure enough to withstand unexpected shocks. These years of diplomatic service also gave Machiavelli a deep appreciation for the weakness of his beloved Florence. The Republic was governed by committees and councils, making decisions by debate and consensus. This process was slow, often producing compromises that satisfied no one. Florence relied on mercenary soldiers who had no loyalty to the city and often proved unreliable in battle. The city's wealth and culture could not compensate for its lack of military strength and political decisiveness. Machiavelli became convinced that Florence needed its own citizen militia, soldiers who fought for their own city rather than for pay. He argued this position persistently, writing proposals, making speeches, gradually winning support. In 1506, his persistence paid off when he was given authority to organize a militia force. He threw himself into this project with characteristic energy, traveling throughout Florentine territory to recruit and train soldiers. The force he created proved moderately successful in several small campaigns, giving Machiavelli great satisfaction and confirming his belief that military strength must rest on citizen virtue rather than mercenary gold. But all of Machiavelli's work for Florence, all his diplomatic skill and his efforts at military reform, would prove insufficient against the great powers that were reshaping Italy. In 1512, Spanish troops, fighting on behalf of Pope Julius II and his Holy League, invaded Tuscany to restore the Medici family to power in Florence. The city's defenses, including Machiavelli's militia, crumbled. The Medici returned in triumph, and the republic that Machiavelli had served so faithfully came to an end. For Machiavelli, the return of the Medici was a personal catastrophe. He was dismissed from office, forbidden to enter the government palace where he had worked for 14 years. Worse was to come. In 1513, a plot against the Medici was discovered, and Machiavelli's name appeared on a list found in the possession of one of the conspirators. Although he almost certainly had no involvement in the plot, he had been out of power and had no means to conspire. He was arrested, imprisoned, and tortured. The torture involved the strappado, a horrific procedure where the victim's hands were tied behind his back, and he was hauled up by a rope attached to his wrists, then dropped suddenly, dislocating the shoulders. Machiavelli endured this torture 6 times but maintained his innocence. Eventually, he was released, partly because there was no real evidence against him, and partly because a general amnesty was declared to celebrate the election of Giovanni de' Medici as Pope Leo X. Machiavelli retreated to his small farm in the countryside outside Florence, effectively exiled from the political life that had been his passion and profession. He was 43 years old, his career apparently over, his future uncertain. For a man who had lived at the center of great events, who had corresponded with kings and observed the machinations of popes, this rural exile must have seemed like a kind of death. But it was in this period of forced retirement and disappointment that Machiavelli produced the works that would make his name immortal. Denied the opportunity to practice politics, he devoted himself to thinking and writing about it. In the evenings, as he later described in a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, he would remove his muddy, everyday clothes and put on the formal robes he had worn at court. Then he would enter his study and immerse himself in conversation with the great minds of antiquity, reading their books, thinking about their ideas, and developing his own theories based on his years of observation and experience. It was in this state of mind, in this combination of bitter disappointment and intellectual freedom, that Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, completing this short but explosive book in a matter of months. The work was not published during his lifetime. It circulated in manuscript form among friends and intellectuals, but its ideas began to spread, acquiring a reputation that was both admiring and scandalized. The Prince is a brief work, barely more than 100 pages, divided into 26 short chapters. But within those pages, Machiavelli systematically challenged many of the fundamental assumptions about politics and ethics that had governed Western thought for centuries. He claimed to be offering practical advice about how to acquire and maintain political power, based not on how people ought to behave but on how they actually do behave. He insisted that he was describing the truth of things as they are, rather than imagining perfect republics and principalities that have never existed. The book begins with a dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici, grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent and current ruler of Florence. Machiavelli clearly hoped that this dedication might win him employment with the new Medici regime, that his expertise might once again be valued. The dedication is humble, almost obsequious, as Machiavelli presents his little book as a gift from someone who knows the territory intimately, offering guidance to the prince who must rule it. But this humility is deceptive, for the book that follows is anything but submissive. It is bold, iconoclastic, and in many ways revolutionary. The early chapters of The Prince establish a taxonomy of states and rulers. Machiavelli distinguishes between republics and principalities, between hereditary states where power passes from father to son, and new principalities that must be conquered or created. He analyzes the different challenges faced by each type of ruler, the different strategies required for maintaining power in different circumstances. This is the work of a systematic thinker, someone trained in the scholastic method of dividing and categorizing, but applied to political reality rather than abstract philosophy. But as the book progresses, Machiavelli moves beyond mere description to offer advice that is startling in its frankness. He discusses how a prince should deal with newly conquered territories, suggesting that sometimes it is necessary to eliminate the old ruling family entirely to prevent rebellions. He explains that it is safer to be feared than loved, because love depends on the inconstant gratitude of others, while fear depends on the prince's ability to punish, which is always in his control. He recommends that a prince should learn how not to be good, to set aside conventional morality when political necessity requires it. One of the most controversial chapters in The Prince is the 18th, which discusses how a prince should keep his word. Here Machiavelli seems to give license to deception and betrayal. He acknowledges that it would be praiseworthy for a prince to always keep his promises, to be honest and straightforward in all his dealings. But, he argues, experience shows that the most successful princes have been those who knew how to deceive, who kept faith only when it served their interest, and who were skilled at manipulating the minds of men. Machiavelli uses the metaphor of the fox and the lion to explain this principle. A prince must have the qualities of both animals, the lion's strength to frighten wolves, and the fox's cunning to recognize traps. Those who rely only on the lion's nature do not understand their business, he argues. A prince must be able to disguise his true nature, to appear merciful, faithful, humane, and religious while being prepared to act contrary to these qualities when necessary. The key, Machiavelli emphasizes, is appearance rather than reality. A prince must seem to have good qualities, because most people judge by appearances and results rather than by examining the underlying reality. This advice shocked readers who were accustomed to political philosophy that emphasized the importance of genuine virtue in rulers. The classical and Christian traditions both insisted that leadership required moral excellence, that a ruler's legitimacy came from their commitment to justice and the common good. Machiavelli seemed to be saying that this was naive, that successful politics required hypocrisy, that appearance mattered more than reality, that the end justified the means. Yet Machiavelli's argument is more subtle than it first appears. He is not simply advocating immorality or claiming that princes should be wicked. Rather, he is recognizing that political life operates according to different rules than private morality. A prince has responsibilities to preserve his state and protect his people that may require actions that would be inexcusable in a private individual. Machiavelli is trying to think clearly about this tension, to acknowledge it rather than paper it over with pious platitudes. Consider his famous discussion of cruelty and clemency. Is it better for a prince to be loved or feared? Ideally, one would want to be both, but since it is difficult to achieve both simultaneously, Machiavelli argues it is safer to be feared. This is not because he values cruelty for its own sake, but because fear is more reliable. Love depends on human gratitude and loyalty, which are fragile things. Fear depends on the threat of punishment, which is within the prince's control. A prince who is loved but not feared will find his people's affection vanishing in times of danger. A prince who is feared will maintain obedience even when his people bear him no love. But, and this is crucial, Machiavelli insists that a prince must avoid being hated. Fear and hatred are different things. A prince can make people afraid of him while still being respected, even admired, as long as he does not take their property or their women, as long as his cruelty serves a clear purpose and is not exercised capriciously. The key is to use cruelty well, which means using it sparingly, decisively, and for clear necessity, rather than badly, which means using it constantly, randomly, or for personal satisfaction. This distinction reveals something important about Machiavelli's thought. He is not a nihilist or a cynic who believes that might makes right. He recognizes that rulers operate within constraints, that there are better and worse ways to exercise power, that effectiveness is different from arbitrary violence. A truly Machiavellian prince is not a tyrant who indulges every cruel impulse, but a calculated realist who understands when force is necessary and when mercy serves his interests better. Machiavelli illustrates these principles with examples drawn from history and his own experience. He discusses Cesare Borgia at length, analyzing both his successes and his ultimate failure. He praises Caesare's ability to build a state from chaos, his decisiveness, his understanding of how to inspire fear and loyalty. But he also notes that Cesare made crucial errors. He allowed Giuliano della Rovere to become pope even though Giuliano was his enemy, a mistake born from overconfidence in his own abilities to manipulate the papal election. He also discusses Agathocles, a Sicilian tyrant who rose from humble origins to become king of Syracuse through murder and betrayal. Machiavelli acknowledges Agathocles' effectiveness, his courage, his ability to endure hardships, his success in maintaining power despite constant warfare. But Machiavelli refuses to call him virtuous, because his crimes were too excessive, too cruel, serving his ambition rather than any defensible political necessity. This distinction suggests that Machiavelli does have moral standards, even if they are more pragmatic and context-dependent than traditional ethics would allow. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli emphasizes the role of virtù and fortuna in political life. These Italian terms are difficult to translate precisely, but understanding them is essential to grasping Machiavelli's thought. Virtue is not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but rather a combination of skill, strength, courage, flexibility, and prudence, whatever qualities enable a person to master circumstances and achieve their goals. Fortuna is not just luck or chance, but the unpredictable, uncontrollable element in human affairs, the way circumstances can change suddenly and overturn even the best plans. Machiavelli uses a vivid metaphor to describe the relationship between virtue and fortuna. Fortune, he says, is like a river that sometimes floods violently, destroying everything in its path. People blame fortune for these disasters, but Machiavelli argues that when times are calm, wise people should build dams and channels to control the river's flow. Those who fail to prepare in good times have only themselves to blame when fortune turns against them. Fortuna governs about half of human affairs, Machiavelli suggests, but virtue can control the other half, and can mitigate fortune's impact if properly exercised. This balance between virtue and fortuna is one reason Machiavelli values flexibility and adaptability in princes. The world is always changing, and what succeeds in one situation may fail in another. A prince must be able to adjust his methods to circumstances, to be bold when boldness is needed and cautious when caution serves better. The problem, Machiavelli observes, is that people are often trapped by their own nature and past success. A cautious man who succeeds through caution will continue to be cautious even when circumstances demand boldness. A bold prince who succeeds through audacity will continue to take risks even when prudence would serve him better. This insight into human psychology is characteristic of Machiavelli's approach. He is constantly observing how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave or how moralists say they should behave. He notes how short human memory is, how easily people are deceived by appearances, how much they care about their property and personal safety, how little they understand about complex political situations. These observations are not meant as insults but as realistic assessments that a prince must take into account when making decisions. The final chapters of The Prince take on a different tone. Machiavelli turns his attention specifically to Italy, analyzing why the peninsula has been overrun by foreign armies and proposing what would be needed to liberate it. Here the detached analyst becomes a passionate patriot, calling for a redeemer who will drive out the barbarians and unite Italy under a single strong ruler. He quotes Petrarch's famous poem calling for such a deliverer, and his language becomes more emotional, more urgent. This shift has puzzled some readers. Is Machiavelli suddenly abandoning his cold realism for nationalist sentiment? Or has this been his purpose all along, to provide the practical knowledge that a potential unifier of Italy would need to succeed? Perhaps both are true. Machiavelli's analysis is genuinely scientific, genuinely an attempt to understand power as it really operates. But this understanding is not neutral or dispassionate in its ultimate purpose. Machiavelli wants his knowledge to be used, wants a strong leader to emerge who can end the chaos and foreign domination that had devastated Italy during his lifetime. The book concludes with a famous exhortation: this opportunity must not be allowed to pass, so that Italy, after such a long time, may at last find her redeemer. Machiavelli's realism was never merely academic. It was meant to serve practical ends, to help create a better political reality even if the means to achieve that reality sometimes violated conventional moral standards. After completing The Prince, Machiavelli turned his attention to a longer and in many ways more profound work, his Discourses on Livy. While The Prince focuses on principalities and individual rulers, the Discourses examines republics and the role of citizens in political life. Here Machiavelli's own republican sympathies emerge more clearly, as he discusses the Roman Republic in detail, analyzing the sources of its strength and the causes of its decline. The Discourses reveal the full complexity of Machiavelli's political thought. He admires strong individual leaders like those discussed in The Prince, but he also recognizes that republics, where power is distributed among citizens rather than concentrated in a prince, can be more stable and more conducive to freedom over the long term. The tension between these two forms of government, between the virtues required for each, runs throughout his work. In the Discourses, Machiavelli discusses the importance of laws and institutions in shaping political behavior. He argues that good laws create good citizens, that the structure of government determines whether people will be public-spirited or selfish, brave or cowardly, free or servile. This is a more optimistic view than the prince sometimes suggests. It implies that political design can shape human nature to serve good ends. He also discusses conflict and its role in political life, making an argument that would have surprised his contemporaries. The conflict between patricians and plebeians in Rome, he suggests, was not a weakness but a source of strength. It was this conflict, properly channeled through institutions like the tribunes who represented the common people, that kept Roman citizens vigilant and prevented any single group from gaining too much power. A certain amount of discord, Machiavelli argues, is healthy in a republic, preventing corruption and complacency. This idea of productive conflict was revolutionary. Most political thinkers emphasized harmony and unity as the goals of good government. Machiavelli recognized that unanimity often masks oppression, that a society where no one complains is likely one where dissent has been crushed rather than where everyone is content. Better to have open conflict, channeled through legitimate institutions, than apparent peace maintained through fear. The Discourses also develops Machiavelli's thinking about religion and its role in political life. He is blunt, almost shockingly so, in treating religion as a tool of political control rather than a source of transcendent truth. He praises the Romans for using religion to maintain social order and inspire civic virtue, while criticizing Christianity for making people weak and otherworldly rather than strong and civic-minded. The ancient paganism, he suggests, celebrated worldly glory and martial virtue, qualities useful for building and defending states. Christianity, by contrast, emphasizes humility, suffering, and the afterlife, diverting attention from earthly politics to heavenly salvation. This critique of Christianity was dangerous ground even for a writer in Renaissance Italy. Machiavelli seems to be suggesting that Christianity, whatever its spiritual merits, has political disadvantages. He stops short of open atheism. He never denies the truth of Christian doctrine, but his instrumental view of religion, valuing it for its political utility rather than its theological truth, disturbed many readers. Here was someone who discussed religion the way he discussed military strategy, as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Yet we should be careful not to overstate Machiavelli's irreligion. He lived in an age when religious belief was nearly universal, and there is no evidence that he himself was an atheist or even particularly impious in his personal life. What he objected to was not Christianity as such, but a certain interpretation of Christianity that emphasized passive acceptance of injustice and devalued political engagement. A Christianity that inspired people to defend their freedom and work for justice in this world could serve republican purposes, even if the medieval church had often failed to do so. In addition to The Prince and the Discourses, Machiavelli wrote other works during his years of exile from political life. He composed histories, including a commissioned history of Florence that traced the city's development from its origins to the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent. This work shows Machiavelli's skill as a narrative historian, his ability to bring the past to life while drawing lessons about political behavior. He also wrote plays, including his comedy The Mandrake, which became one of the most popular theatrical works of the Renaissance. The play is a bawdy farce about seduction and deception, but it also contains serious observations about human nature and the gap between appearance and reality, themes that echo his political writings. The main character succeeds through clever manipulation and shameless exploitation of others' weaknesses. He is, in his way, a Machiavellian hero operating in domestic rather than political life. These artistic and historical works reveal dimensions of Machiavelli's thought that might be missed if we focus only on The Prince. He was not simply a cold analyst of power but a man of considerable literary talent, someone who understood human psychology in all its complexity, who could portray character with subtlety and humor. His political realism was grounded in a deep understanding of human nature that came from lived experience and careful observation, not from cynicism or misanthropy. As the years passed, Machiavelli gradually regained some favor with the Medici. He was commissioned to write the history of Florence, received a small pension, and was occasionally consulted on minor matters. But he never recovered his former position of influence, never again stood at the center of great events. His letters from this period reveal frustration and sadness, the sense of a man whose talents were wasted, who had more to give but no one willing to receive it. In 1527, dramatic political events once again transformed Florence. The Medici Pope Clement VII, having made enemies of both France and Spain through diplomatic miscalculations, found himself attacked by imperial forces that sacked Rome in an orgy of violence and sacrilege. The shock of this catastrophe, this assault on the Holy City by Christian soldiers, reverberated throughout Europe. In Florence, the Medici were once again expelled, and a republic was restored. One might think this would have been a moment of triumph for Machiavelli, a vindication of his republican principles and perhaps an opportunity to return to public service. But the new Republican government viewed him with suspicion precisely because he had cooperated with the Medici during their rule. To the younger, more idealistic Republicans, Machiavelli's pragmatism looked like opportunism, his realism like cynicism. He was too associated with the compromises of the past to be trusted by those who wanted a pure renewal. Machiavelli died on June 21, 1527, just a few weeks after the Republic was restored. He was 58 years old. The cause of death was probably illness, perhaps aggravated by the medicines of the time. He died disappointed, having never regained the political position he had lost, having seen his advice ignored, his experience wasted. His great works remained unpublished, circulating only in manuscript among a limited circle of readers. And yet, as Machiavelli's mortal life came to its quiet end in that summer of 1527, his ideas were already beginning their own journey, a journey that would take them far beyond the walls of Florence, beyond the borders of Italy, across centuries and continents, shaping the thoughts of princes and philosophers, revolutionaries and tyrants, anyone who grappled with the eternal questions of power and its proper use. The Prince was not published until 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death. When it finally appeared in print, it arrived into a world already primed to be shocked by it. Manuscript copies had been circulating for nearly 2 decades, and rumors of its scandalous content had spread throughout Italy and beyond. The book's publication created an immediate sensation, provoking reactions that ranged from horrified condemnation to fascinated admiration. The Catholic Church placed the Prince on its index of prohibited books in 1559, condemning it as immoral and heretical. Religious authorities saw in Machiavelli's work a dangerous separation of politics from Christian ethics, a worldview that treated faith as merely instrumental rather than transcendent. The adjective Machiavellian entered European languages as a term of abuse, synonymous with cunning, duplicity, and ruthless self-interest. In England, the dramatists of the Elizabethan age created villainous characters they called Machiavels, scheming figures who proclaimed their wickedness and boasted of their manipulations. Yet even as Machiavelli's name became a byword for evil, his actual ideas were being quietly absorbed by those who held power or aspired to it. Kings and their advisors read the Prince in secret, finding in it practical wisdom that could not be openly acknowledged. The book became one of those works that everyone condemned but many studied, whose influence spread precisely because it articulated truths that conventional morality forbade speaking aloud. Part of the scandal surrounding Machiavelli came from a fundamental misunderstanding of his purpose. Many readers interpreted The Prince as a handbook for tyrants, a guide to acquiring and maintaining power through wickedness. But this reading misses the sophistication of Machiavelli's analysis. He was not advocating tyranny but describing the realities of political life, the difficult choices that leaders face, the gap between how we wish the world to be and how it actually is. Machiavelli understood something that his critics often missed, that politics operates in a realm of necessity different from private morality. A private individual can afford to be scrupulous about always telling the truth, always keeping promises, never using violence. But a political leader who behaves this way in all circumstances will likely fail to protect their state and people, will be outmaneuvered by less scrupulous rivals, will see their city conquered and their citizens enslaved or killed. The ethics of responsibility, which asks what consequences will follow from our actions, sometimes conflicts with the ethics of conviction, which demands that we adhere to principles regardless of consequences. This insight makes Machiavelli not simply an advocate of immorality but rather a profound theorist of the tragic dimension of political life. He recognizes that sometimes there are no good choices, only less bad ones. Sometimes protecting the innocent requires actions that dirty one's hands. Sometimes the long-term good requires short-term evils. This is not comfortable doctrine, it offers no easy answers, no way to feel entirely virtuous about our political choices, but it may be closer to the truth than more comforting philosophies that pretend such dilemmas do not exist. Consider Machiavelli's discussion of whether it is better for a prince to destroy a conquered city completely or to try to win its people's loyalty through clemency. The humane answer, the Christian answer, would seem obvious: show mercy, spare the innocent, try to win hearts and minds. But Machiavelli observes that this approach often fails. The conquered people harbor resentment, await opportunities for revenge, rebel at the first sign of weakness. The prince who showed mercy finds himself betrayed, and must then use even greater cruelty to suppress the rebellion. The result is more suffering than if he had been harsh from the beginning. On the other hand, destroying the city entirely, killing or dispersing its inhabitants, eliminates the threat of rebellion but at an enormous moral cost. Machiavelli does not flinch from describing these options clearly. He is not saying that wholesale slaughter is good or praiseworthy. He is saying that sometimes these are the choices political leaders actually face, and pretending otherwise does not make the dilemma go away. There is also a republican dimension to the prince that is often overlooked. Machiavelli's ultimate goal was not to help tyrants but to free Italy from foreign domination and internal chaos. He believed that in the crisis of his time, what Italy needed was a strong, decisive leader who could unite the peninsula and establish order. This leader would need to use Machiavellian methods, carefully controlled cruelty, strategic deception, ruthless elimination of threats, not out of personal wickedness but to achieve a goal that transcended personal ambition. Once order was established, once Italy was united and defended, then better forms of government might become possible. The harsh methods of the founder would give way to the rule of law, the arbitrary power of the prince to the ordered liberty of the republic. Machiavelli's model here was ancient Rome, founded according to legend by Romulus, who murdered his brother and ruled as king, but whose action made possible the republic that followed, the greatest and most enduring political achievement of the ancient world. This idea of the necessary founding violence, the exceptional individual whose extraordinary actions make ordinary political life possible, would have enormous influence on later political thought. Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx all grappled with variations of this theme. The revolutionary who must break the old order to create space for the new, the lawgiver who stands outside the normal rules to establish the law itself, these are all descendants of Machiavelli's prince, the Redeemer who will liberate Italy. But we must also acknowledge the dangers in this line of thinking. How do we know when such exceptional measures are truly necessary? Who decides when the emergency is severe enough to justify abandoning normal ethical constraints? How do we prevent the exception from becoming the rule, the temporary dictatorship from becoming permanent tyranny? These questions have haunted political life from Machiavelli's time to our own, and no simple answers exist. The historical influence of the prince is difficult to measure precisely because it has been so pervasive. Every modern discussion of realpolitik, of the relationship between ethics and politics, of the uses and limits of state power, exists in Machiavelli's shadow. He did not invent political realism. Clear-eyed observation of power's realities existed long before him, but he gave it systematic expression, stripped away the pious disguises, forced readers to confront uncomfortable truths. Some rulers have explicitly acknowledged Machiavelli's influence. Frederick the Great of Prussia wrote a book in his youth titled Anti-Machiavel, condemning the prince as wicked and immoral. Yet in his actual practice as king, Frederick employed many classically Machiavellian strategies: sudden attacks on neighbors, broken treaties when convenient, manipulation of public opinion. The gap between his public denunciation and private practice perfectly illustrates Machiavelli's own observation about the importance of appearance versus reality. Napoleon Bonaparte reportedly studied the prince carefully, and his career embodied many Machiavellian principles. He rose through a combination of genuine military talent and ruthless political maneuvering. He understood the importance of propaganda and symbolic gestures, crowning himself emperor in a ceremony designed to evoke ancient Rome. He maintained power through a mixture of genuine popularity and carefully calibrated fear. And when fortune finally turned against him, when the other European powers united to defeat him, his fall demonstrated the limits of individual virtue against overwhelming circumstances. In the 20th century, political leaders across the ideological spectrum found inspiration or at least recognition in Machiavelli's work. Lenin and Mussolini both read him, though they drew very different lessons. American political scientists developed theories of rational choice and strategic behavior that owed much to Machiavellian assumptions about human nature. Business leaders and corporate strategists found in the Prince a guide to competitive behavior, translating its lessons from the political to the economic sphere. This wide applicability is itself revealing. Machiavelli's insights seem to transcend particular ideologies or systems, speaking to something fundamental about human behavior in situations of competition and conflict. His analysis does not depend on any particular religious or philosophical commitment but on observation of what people actually do when their interests conflict, when cooperation and trust break down, when stakes are high and consequences severe. Yet Machiavelli should not be reduced simply to a theorist of power politics. His thought contains other dimensions that enrich and complicate the stark realism of the prince. In his discourses on Livy, as we have noted, he reveals himself as a sincere republican, someone who believed that properly structured republics were superior to principalities, that citizen participation in politics was not only possible but essential for freedom and civic virtue. Machiavelli's republicanism was not naive or idealistic. He understood that republics faced their own challenges, that democratic deliberation could be slow and inefficient, that popular passion could be as dangerous as princely ambition. But he believed that over the long term, free citizens fighting for their own city would prove more reliable than mercenaries fighting for pay, that laws and institutions could channel human self-interest toward public benefit, that liberty once tasted was worth defending even at great cost. This tension between Machiavelli the Republican and Machiavelli the analyst of princely power has generated endless scholarly debate. Did he really believe in the harsh advice he gave princes, or was the prince a kind of satire, exposing the wickedness of tyranny by describing it so frankly? This theory, suggested by some later commentators, seems unlikely given the earnestness with which Machiavelli dedicated the book to Lorenzo de' Medici and clearly hoped for employment. But it points to a real ambiguity in his work, a sense that he contained contradictions that he never fully resolved. Perhaps the resolution lies in recognizing that Machiavelli was above all a contextualist. Different situations call for different approaches. In times of chaos and foreign invasion, when traditional institutions have failed and the state itself is threatened, strong individual leadership may be necessary, even if it requires methods that would be inappropriate in calmer times. Once order is established and external threats are contained, then republican institutions and civic virtue can flourish. The methods appropriate for founding or saving a state are not the same as those appropriate for maintaining it in ordinary times. This contextual thinking reflects Machiavelli's fundamental belief in the variability of political circumstances and the need for flexibility in response. He lived through a period of rapid and dramatic change, saw states rise and fall, witnessed the traditional order of medieval Christendom giving way to something new and uncertain. In such times, rigid adherence to old rules and assumptions could be fatal. Success required adaptability, clear-eyed assessment of circumstances, willingness to revise one's methods when conditions changed. Machiavelli's emphasis on the study of history reflects this belief in learning from experience. Throughout his works, he draws examples from ancient Rome, medieval Italy, and his own time, comparing situations, analyzing what succeeded and what failed. History, for Machiavelli, was not simply a record of past events but a laboratory for political science, a source of case studies that could guide present action. This use of history was characteristic of Renaissance humanism, but Machiavelli applied it with unusual rigor and lack of sentimentality. Many humanist scholars idealized ancient Rome, treating it as a perfect model to be imitated. Machiavelli admired Rome deeply but also analyzed its failures, the ways its institutions broke down, the mistakes that led to the fall of the Republic and the rise of empire. He wanted to learn from Rome's successes and its failures, to understand the underlying principles rather than simply copy surface forms. His historical method was also notably secular. Earlier political thought, especially in the Middle Ages, had interpreted political events as manifestations of divine providence, as rewards for virtue or punishments for sin. Machiavelli, while not denying the existence of God or divine providence in principle, simply set these considerations aside in his analysis. He looked for natural causes, human motivations, the interaction of character and circumstance. This methodological secularism, this bracketing of supernatural explanation, was one of his most important contributions to the development of modern political science. It is worth pausing to reflect on Machiavelli's prose style, which contributed greatly to the impact of his ideas. He wrote in Italian rather than Latin, making his works accessible to a broader audience than scholarly treatises written in the language of learning. His style was direct, clear, concrete. He avoided the elaborate rhetorical flourishes common in humanist writing, preferring short, punchy sentences that drove home his points with force. This stylistic directness matched his intellectual directness. Just as he stripped away the pious disguises that conventionally concealed the realities of power, so his prose stripped away decorative language to present his arguments nakedly. Reading Machiavelli, even in translation, one feels the force of a mind that has seen through pretense and refuses to participate in comforting fictions. At the same time, his writing is not entirely dry or purely analytical. He could be witty, ironic, even playful. His letters to friends show humor and self-awareness, an ability to laugh at his own misfortunes and the absurdities of human behavior. The Mandrake, his theatrical comedy, demonstrates considerable skill at creating believable characters and amusing situations. This literary talent suggests that Machiavelli understood human nature not just intellectually but also imaginatively, that he could put himself in others' positions and see the world from their perspectives. Let us consider more deeply some of the key concepts that run through Machiavelli's thought, beginning with his famous discussion of virtù. This Italian word, derived from the Latin virtus, had traditionally meant moral virtue, the qualities of character that made someone a good person. But Machiavelli transforms the concept, using it to mean something like effectiveness, the qualities that make someone successful in achieving their goals. For Machiavelli, virtù includes courage and strength, certainly, but also flexibility, intelligence, the ability to read situations accurately and respond appropriately. It means being bold when boldness is required and cautious when caution serves better. It means understanding human psychology well enough to manipulate others without being manipulated yourself. It means having the strength of will to do what is necessary even when it is unpleasant or morally questionable. This redefinition of virtue was radical and disturbing. Traditional morality said that certain actions were simply wrong, regardless of their consequences: lying, breaking promises, killing innocents. Machiavelli's virtue seems to set aside these absolute prohibitions, making effectiveness the measure of right action. Yet this is perhaps too simple. Machiavelli does distinguish between cruelty well used and cruelty poorly used, between necessary deception and gratuitous lying. He recognizes that some actions, even if effective in the short term, undermine long-term success by making the prince hated. So there are still standards, still better and worse ways of acting, just not the simple moral absolutes of traditional ethics. Fortuna, fortune, or chance, is virtue's necessary complement in Machiavelli's thought. He recognizes that no amount of skill or courage can guarantee success, that events beyond our control shape outcomes in ways we cannot predict or prevent. A sudden plague, an unexpected military defeat, the death of a key ally, any of these can overturn the best-laid plans and bring down the most capable leader. Machiavelli's famous metaphor comparing fortune to a river that floods is worth examining more closely. He says that when rivers flood violently in winter, they sweep away everything before them, and people blame fortune for the destruction. But during calm times, people could have built dams and channels to control the water's flow. Fortune, he suggests, shows its power where no virtue has been prepared to resist it. This metaphor reveals Machiavelli's fundamentally active, aggressive attitude toward life. We are not simply victims of fate, not merely passive sufferers of fortune's whims. Through foresight, preparation, and decisive action, we can shape our circumstances, can build those dams and channels that will protect us when the storm comes. This requires taking fortune seriously as a force we must contend with, but not accepting it as an excuse for passivity or failure. Machiavelli also makes a striking claim about fortune and young men. Fortune, he says, is a woman, and like women, in his quite conventional Renaissance view, she is more attracted to the bold and impetuous than to the cautious and calculating. Young men, who are naturally more audacious, therefore succeed with fortune more often than older men who have learned prudence. This gendered language is jarring to modern readers, but the underlying observation is interesting. Sometimes boldness succeeds precisely because it is unexpected, because it disrupts others' calculations, because fortune favors those who seize initiative rather than waiting to respond to events. The relationship between virtue and fortuna points to a deeper theme in Machiavelli's thought: the tension between human agency and structural constraints, between what we can control and what we cannot. He wants to maximize human agency, to expand the scope of what can be achieved through skill and will. But he is also realistic about limits, about the ways circumstances can overwhelm even the most capable individual. This tension plays out in his analysis of why Italy has been overrun by foreign powers. Is it because Italians lack virtue, have become weak and effeminate? Or is it because structural factors, Italy's division into competing states, the weakness of its military technology, the overwhelming resources of unified kingdoms like France and Spain, make Italian independence impossible regardless of individual leadership? Machiavelli seems torn between these explanations. He wants to believe that the right leader with sufficient virtue could unite and defend Italy, that his analysis in The Prince provides the knowledge necessary for such a leader to succeed. But he also recognizes the enormous structural obstacles, the way Italy's political fragmentation and military backwardness put it at a severe disadvantage against powerful monarchies with professional armies. This brings us to another key theme: Machiavelli's analysis of military power and its relationship to political order. He was convinced that military strength was essential for state survival, that no amount of wealth or culture could substitute for the ability to defend oneself. His experience as second chancellor had taught him that Florence's reliance on mercenary soldiers was a fundamental weakness, that hired troops had no loyalty and would flee or betray you when danger pressed. The solution, he argued, was a citizen militia, soldiers who fought for their own city, their own homes and families, rather than for pay. Such soldiers would have the motivation to fight bravely, the commitment to endure hardships, the loyalty that mercenaries could never possess. This idea harked back to ancient Rome, where citizen soldiers had built an empire, and forward to modern nationalism with its armies of conscripts fighting for their nation. But citizen militias required a certain kind of political system to work. Soldiers fighting for their city needed to feel that the city was theirs, that they had a stake in its survival and prosperity. This worked in republics where citizens participated in government and enjoyed the fruits of their labor. It worked less well in principalities where subjects had no voice and might see little difference between one master and another. This military analysis thus connects to Machiavelli's broader political thought. Good arms require good laws, and good laws require good arms. The two are inseparable. A well-ordered state needs both the internal structure of law and institutions, and the external capacity to defend itself against enemies. Political theorists who focus only on justice and constitutional arrangements while ignoring military realities are building castles in the air. Military experts who focus only on weapons and tactics while ignoring political legitimacy and motivation are equally short-sighted. Machiavelli's concern with military affairs was not just theoretical. His effort to create a Florentine militia, his practical involvement in recruitment and training, showed his commitment to putting his ideas into practice. The militia's mixed record in actual combat, successful in some small engagements, insufficient against professional Spanish troops, illustrated the gap between theory and practice, the difficulty of transforming corrupt material into effective force. This touches on another of Machiavelli's concerns, corruption, not in the narrow sense of bribery or personal dishonesty, but in the broader sense of moral and civic decay. A corrupt populace, grown soft through luxury and accustomed to servitude, cannot suddenly be transformed into brave citizen soldiers. A corrupt elite, concerned only with private gain rather than public good, cannot provide the leadership necessary for effective government. Once corruption has deeply infected a society, Machiavelli suggests, only the most drastic measures can restore health, perhaps only the violent intervention of a Machiavellian prince who can force reform through harsh discipline. This pessimistic view of corruption and its remedies reflects Machiavelli's sense that political orders have life cycles. They are founded in virtue, maintained through good laws and institutions, but gradually decay as citizens forget the struggles and sacrifices that created their freedom. Eventually the decay becomes so advanced that the old order must be swept away, either through internal revolution or external conquest, and a new founding must occur. Nothing lasts forever. All human institutions tend toward entropy unless constantly renewed through struggle and sacrifice. Yet Machiavelli also believed that intelligent institutional design could slow this decay, could maintain civic virtue for longer periods. The Roman Republic endured for centuries because its institutions channeled conflict productively, prevented any group from gaining absolute power, and gave citizens meaningful participation in political life. When Rome finally fell into corruption and civil war, it was partly because these institutions had been undermined, had failed to adapt to the pressures of empire and the destabilizing effects of enormous wealth. This belief in the power of institutions to shape behavior is one of Machiavelli's most important contributions to political thought. Human nature may be constant, people are generally selfish, short-sighted, cowardly unless circumstance forces them to be otherwise. But institutions can harness these constant features of human nature, can create incentives for public-spirited behavior, can punish corruption and reward virtue. Good institutions do not require people to be angels, they work with human nature as it is, channeling self-interest toward public benefit. This insight has influenced countless later thinkers, from Montesquieu's analysis of how separation of powers prevents tyranny, to Madison's arguments in the Federalist Papers that constitutional structure can make even ambitious men serve the public good, to modern economic theories about how properly designed markets and regulations can harness self-interest for social welfare. The idea that we can engineer better societies not by changing human nature but by designing better institutions traces directly back to Machiavelli. Let us also consider Machiavelli's view of religion and its political uses. His stance here was complex and easily misunderstood. He was not, as far as we can tell, an atheist who denied the existence of God or the truth of Christianity. But he did treat religion primarily as a political phenomenon, evaluating it by its effects on civic life rather than by its theological truth. From this perspective, ancient Roman religion appeared superior to Christianity. Roman religion celebrated martial virtue, civic duty, worldly glory, qualities useful for building and defending a state. Its gods were projections of human excellence, and worshipping them meant aspiring to strength, courage, wisdom. The Romans used religion to inspire soldiers before battle, to solemnize oaths and treaties, to maintain social order through the fear of divine punishment for crimes. Christianity, by contrast, seemed to Machiavelli to promote qualities less useful politically: humility, sufferance, contempt for worldly things, focus on the afterlife rather than earthly glory. These might be valuable spiritual qualities, but they made poor citizens and soldiers. A people thoroughly imbued with Christian otherworldliness would have difficulty defending themselves, would prefer martyrdom to resistance, would forgive enemies rather than crushing them. Machiavelli was careful to blame this not on Christianity itself but on its interpretation. Christianity could be read differently, he suggested, in ways that inspired military courage and civic virtue. The problem was centuries of church teaching that emphasized passive virtues and neglected active ones. A reformed Christianity, properly understood, need not weaken states or enervate citizens. This critique was dangerous ground in an age when religious orthodoxy was enforced by the Inquisition and heretics were burned at the stake. Machiavelli was careful in his wording, but his meaning was clear enough to get his works condemned by the church. He was suggesting that religion should serve political ends, that its value lay in its social utility rather than its supernatural truth, that states might need to manipulate religious belief to serve civic purposes. Yet there is something more subtle here as well. Machiavelli understood that people need beliefs that transcend mere self-interest, need to feel they are part of something larger and more important than their individual lives. Religion provides this sense of meaning and purpose, binds communities together through shared ritual and belief, gives people reasons to sacrifice for the common good. A purely secular state, one that appeals only to material interests, might lack the emotional and spiritual resources necessary for survival in times of crisis. This recognition of religion's social and psychological functions, separate from questions of theological truth, was quite modern. It anticipated later thinkers like Durkheim who would analyze religion as a social phenomenon, or Freud who would examine its psychological roots. Machiavelli was not primarily interested in whether religious claims were true but in what effects religious belief had on political behavior, and how rulers could use or manage religion to strengthen rather than weaken their states. His own religious views remained somewhat mysterious. He attended church, received sacraments, and gave no public indication of heterodoxy in personal faith. But his private letters occasionally display a certain ironic distance from religious claims, a tone of sophisticated skepticism that contrasts with the piety expected in his era. Perhaps he was a conventional believer who simply thought religious matters should be kept separate from political analysis. Perhaps he was privately skeptical but publicly conforming. Or perhaps his faith was genuine but complicated, capable of holding together sincere belief and analytical distance. Whatever his personal beliefs, Machiavelli's treatment of religion as a political phenomenon rather than a transcendent truth marked an important step toward the secularization of political thought. Later thinkers would go further, developing fully secular political philosophies that made no reference to divine authority or religious principles. But Machiavelli pioneered this separation of political analysis from theological premises, treating politics as an autonomous sphere with its own rules and logic. Let us turn now to how Machiavelli has been read and misread through the centuries, how his reputation has evolved, how different ages and different readers have found different lessons in his works. The early responses, as we have noted, were largely hostile. Religious authorities condemned him as impious and immoral. Political theorists accused him of counseling tyranny and evil. Shakespeare's plays featured Machiavellian villains who embodied treachery and ambition. The Machiavel became a stock character in literature, the schemer who worked behind the scenes, plotting and manipulating for personal gain. This interpretation was not entirely wrong. The prince does advise rulers to use deception, to break faith when convenient, to employ cruelty strategically. But it misses the complexity and purpose of this advice, treats Machiavelli as simply celebrating wickedness rather than grappling with genuine ethical dilemmas in political life. A more sympathetic reading emerged during the Enlightenment, when thinkers began to appreciate Machiavelli's realism and his republican ideals. Rousseau suggested that the prince was actually a satire, that by revealing the techniques of tyranny so openly, Machiavelli was teaching people how to recognize and resist it. While this interpretation is probably wrong, it seems too clever, too much at odds with what we know of Machiavelli's actual intentions. It reflects a desire to rescue him from his reputation as a teacher of evil. The 19th century saw new interpretations as nationalism reshaped European politics. Italian nationalists read Machiavelli as a prophet of Italian unity, focusing on the final chapter of The Prince with its passionate call for a redeemer to liberate Italy from foreign rule. In this reading, Machiavelli's apparent amoralism was justified by the nobility of his ultimate goal. The harsh methods he recommended were necessary means to the worthy end of national independence and unity. German philosophers, particularly Hegel, saw in Machiavelli a theorist of historical necessity, someone who understood that world historical individuals must sometimes violate conventional morality to accomplish their destinies. This reading emphasized Machiavelli's understanding of the gap between ordinary ethics and the ethics of political founding, between the rules that govern normal times and the freedom required of those who create new political orders. In the 20th century, Machiavelli's reputation underwent yet another transformation. The rise of totalitarian regimes, fascism, Nazism, communism, led some to blame him for creating the intellectual foundations of modern dictatorship. Mussolini wrote admiringly of Machiavelli, claiming him as a precursor of fascist doctrine. This association further darkened Machiavelli's reputation, making him seem not just immoral but dangerous, a thinker whose ideas led directly to the horrors of modern totalitarianism. But this association was fundamentally misleading. Mussolini's regime, with its theatrical bombast, its ideological rigidity, its cult of personality, violated many of Machiavelli's key principles. A true Machiavellian would have recognized that Mussolini's alliance with Hitler was strategically disastrous, that his invasion of Ethiopia squandered resources for symbolic gains, that his grandiose rhetoric obscured practical weaknesses. The problem was not that Mussolini was too Machiavellian, but that he was not Machiavellian enough. He indulged in precisely the kind of showy but ineffective gestures that Machiavelli warned against. More recently, scholars have worked to rescue Machiavelli from these distortions, to see him in his proper historical context, to appreciate the complexity and subtlety of his thought. They have emphasized his republicanism, showing that his ultimate allegiance was to civic freedom rather than princely power. They have noted his genuine concern for the common good, his belief that effective government must serve the people's welfare even if it sometimes requires harsh methods. They have traced his influence on modern democratic thought, showing how his ideas about institutional design, civic participation, and the rule of law contributed to the development of constitutional government. This rehabilitation has perhaps gone too far in the opposite direction, turning Machiavelli into a kind of proto-democrat and downplaying the genuinely troubling elements of his thought. The tension remains. Machiavelli really did advise princes to use cruelty and deception, really did suggest that the end justifies the means, really did separate political ethics from conventional morality. We cannot simply wish away these aspects of his work or pretend they mean something other than what they say. Perhaps the most honest approach is to accept Machiavelli's contradictions, to recognize that he was grappling with genuine dilemmas that admit no easy solutions. Political life really does sometimes require actions that would be wrong in private life. Leaders really do face situations where all available choices involve moral compromise. Effectiveness really is important in politics, not just good intentions. These are uncomfortable truths, but denying them does not make them less true. At the same time, Machiavelli's principles can be used to justify almost any atrocity if one simply claims political necessity. How do we distinguish legitimate uses of Machiavellian methods from illegitimate ones? How do we know when harsh measures are truly necessary rather than merely convenient? How do we prevent the exception from swallowing the rule, the emergency from becoming permanent? Machiavelli himself provides some guidance. He distinguishes between cruelty well used and badly used, between necessary deception and gratuitous lying, between fear that maintains order and hatred that provokes rebellion. He recognizes that even in politics, there are limits, standards, better and worse ways of acting. But these standards are contextual and prudential rather than absolute, requiring judgment rather than simple rule following. And judgment, as Aristotle recognized long ago, is the hardest thing to teach, the quality that separates the truly wise from those who merely know rules. There is also the question of what happens to a society where Machiavellian principles become openly acknowledged and widely practiced. Machiavelli himself assumes a certain naivety in most people, an inability to see through appearances to underlying realities. His prince succeeds partly because others are fooled by his false displays of virtue. But what if everyone reads the prince, everyone understands the techniques of manipulation, everyone is cynical and suspicious? Does Machiavellian politics undermine itself through its own success? Some scholars have suggested that this is precisely what has happened in modern politics. We live in an age of widespread cynicism about political leaders, an assumption that all politicians lie and manipulate, that idealistic claims are always disguises for self-interest. This cynicism may be realistic, may reflect actual patterns of political behavior. But it also corrodes civic trust, makes cooperation more difficult, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where no one acts virtuously because everyone expects everyone else to act selfishly. Machiavelli might respond that this cynicism is simply realism, that recognizing political manipulation makes us less likely to be fooled by it, that clear-eyed understanding of power's mechanics is better than naive idealism. But there is a cost to this clarity, a loss of the illusions and noble lies that perhaps societies need to function well. Once the wizard's tricks are revealed, once everyone knows that the emperor has no clothes, it becomes harder to sustain the shared fictions that bind communities together. This brings us to one of the deepest questions raised by Machiavelli's thought, the relationship between truth and useful belief, between what is and what people need to believe. Machiavelli claims to describe reality as it is, to tell the truth about politics without comforting illusions. But he also recognizes that politics requires managing appearances, that effective rulers must make people believe things that may not be strictly true. So which is more important, truth or useful belief? Can they be reconciled, or must we choose between them? Classical political philosophy, from Plato through the medieval thinkers, generally emphasized the importance of aligning political order with transcendent truth, with the forms in Plato, with natural law in Aristotle and Aquinas, with divine will in Christian thought. The good ruler was one who understood truth and ordered society according to it. Lies and illusions might be necessary occasionally, but they were departures from the ideal, regrettable necessities that should be minimized. Machiavelli inverts this relationship. Useful belief becomes primary, truth secondary. What matters is not whether something is true in some abstract sense but whether believing it produces desirable political outcomes. This is a profoundly modern view, anticipating later pragmatist philosophers who would argue that truth is whatever works, whatever produces beneficial consequences. But it is also troubling, suggesting a kind of relativism where nothing is really true, only more or less useful to believe. Yet Machiavelli himself believes he is telling the truth about politics, believes his analysis corresponds to reality rather than merely being useful to believe. So he does maintain a distinction between truth and falsehood, even as he recognizes that political actors must often traffic in illusions. Perhaps the solution is that Machiavelli addresses two different audiences: the few who can handle truth, the philosophical analysts and capable leaders who must understand how things really work, and the many who need comforting illusions, who would be paralyzed or demoralized by complete clarity about political realities. This esoteric dimension to Machiavelli's writing, the idea that he wrote with different meanings for different readers, has been explored by scholars like Leo Strauss, who argued that many classic political philosophers disguised their true views, writing on multiple levels to communicate dangerous truths to the wise while hiding them from the vulgar. Whether or not Machiavelli consciously adopted this strategy, his works do seem to reward careful reading, to contain layers of meaning that reveal themselves only to those who study them deeply. Consider, for instance, the structure of The Prince itself. The book begins with technical analysis of different types of states and rulers, proceeds through increasingly controversial advice about using cruelty and deception, and culminates in the passionate call for Italian liberation. This progression might be pedagogical, gradually preparing the reader for more radical ideas. Or it might reflect Machiavelli's own thinking, beginning with detached analysis and ending with engaged commitment. Or it might be deliberately designed to provoke different reactions in different readers. Some will be scandalized by the middle chapters and reject the whole work, while others will be convinced by the logic and embrace the conclusion. The ambiguity is perhaps intentional. Machiavelli was, after all, a diplomat, someone practiced in communicating different messages to different audiences, in saying things that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on the listener's interests and assumptions. His writing style, clear on the surface but complex beneath, mirrors this diplomatic skill, presenting apparent simplicity that conceals genuine subtlety. Let us reflect now on what Machiavelli's life and thought can teach us, what wisdom we might extract from his experience for our own time. We live in an age very different from Renaissance Italy, but many of the political challenges he analyzed remain relevant. We still grapple with tensions between ideals and practical necessities, between what we wish politics could be and what it actually is. We still debate how much compromise is acceptable in pursuit of good ends, whether effectiveness matters more than moral purity, how to balance security with liberty. Machiavelli's fundamental lesson is the importance of seeing clearly, of not letting our wishes and ideals blind us to how things actually work. This does not mean embracing cynicism or abandoning moral standards, but it does mean being honest about trade-offs and costs, acknowledging that good outcomes often require morally ambiguous means, accepting that political life is tragic in ways that private morality is not. He also teaches the importance of learning from history, of studying how people actually behave in political situations rather than theorizing about how they ought to behave. History is not just an academic subject but a practical guide, a source of case studies that can inform present action. The specific circumstances change, but human nature remains constant enough that patterns recur, lessons from the past remain applicable. Machiavelli's emphasis on institutions and their power to shape behavior remains perhaps his most constructive contribution. We cannot change human nature, cannot make people fundamentally less selfish or short-sighted. But we can design systems that channel self-interest toward public benefit, that prevent concentration of power, that give people stakes in good governance. This insight underlies modern constitutional democracy, with its separation of powers, its checks and balances, its mechanisms for accountability. His concern with military strength and its relationship to political independence also resonates. States that cannot defend themselves become victims of those that can. Wealth and culture are valuable, but they cannot substitute for the capacity to resist aggression. This lesson has been repeatedly confirmed by history. Wealthy, cultured societies that neglected military preparedness have been conquered by poorer but more martial peoples. The question is how to maintain military strength without allowing it to dominate civil society, how to have good arms without falling under the rule of soldiers. Machiavelli's skepticism about human goodness, his assumption that most people are selfish and will betray you if given opportunity, may seem pessimistic. But it can also be liberating. If we do not expect too much from human nature, we will not be disappointed or paralyzed when people behave badly. We can design systems that work with people as they are rather than requiring them to be angels. This pragmatic anthropology has enabled the development of political systems that function tolerably well despite human imperfection. At the same time, we must resist the temptation to use Machiavelli as an excuse for all behavior, to claim that anything done in the name of political necessity is justified. His thought contains warnings as well as permissions. Leaders who are hated rather than merely feared will provoke resistance. Those who are gratuitously cruel rather than strategically harsh will undermine their own power. Those who break their word constantly will find no one willing to trust them. Even amoral politics has rules and limits. There is also value in maintaining some tension between Machiavellian realism and traditional moral ideals. Machiavelli describes how things are, but we should not necessarily accept this as how things should be. The gap between is and ought creates a productive discomfort, a recognition that political life falls short of our ideals even as we acknowledge that those ideals cannot be fully realized. We need both the idealist who demands that politics live up to moral standards, and the realist who explains why those standards cannot always be met. The conversation between these perspectives, rather than the victory of either one, may be the healthiest stance. Machiavelli himself embodied some of this tension. He was a realist who analyzed power with cold precision, but also a passionate patriot who longed for Italian liberation. He advised princes to use harsh methods, but his ultimate goal was civic freedom and republican government. He separated politics from conventional morality, but not because he thought morality unimportant, rather because he believed that the highest moral purpose, preserving the state and protecting the people, sometimes required violating conventional moral rules. This suggests that Machiavellianism, properly understood, is not simply amorality but a different kind of moral reasoning, consequentialist rather than deontological, focused on outcomes rather than intrinsic rightness of actions, willing to accept moral costs in pursuit of sufficiently important goals. Whether this consequentialist ethics is adequate, whether it can be practiced without sliding into complete amorality, remains an open question. But it is at least a coherent position, an attempt to think seriously about moral dilemmas in political life rather than simply denying they exist. The tragedy of Machiavelli's own life adds poignancy to his thought. Here was a man of considerable talent and dedication, who served his city faithfully for 14 years, who understood politics with unusual clarity and depth. Yet his career ended in dismissal, imprisonment, and exile. His advice was ignored, his experience wasted. He died disappointed, without seeing the Italian unity he dreamed of, without regaining the political position he had lost. This personal failure might seem to undermine his political theories. If he was so wise about politics, why could he not manage his own career more successfully? But perhaps his failure was itself instructive. It demonstrated the role of fortune, the way circumstances beyond individual control can determine outcomes. Machiavelli understood the principles of politics, but he could not control the great historical forces, the Italian wars, the return of the Medici, the suspicion he aroused in Republican zealots, that shaped his fate. Or perhaps his failure reflected a certain inflexibility in his own character. He had advised princes to be adaptable, to adjust their methods to circumstances. But he himself seemed unable or unwilling to transform himself as situations changed. He remained fundamentally a republican in an age of princes, a man of ideas in a world that valued connections and wealth, someone who spoke uncomfortable truths when flattery and discretion might have served him better. There is nobility in this inflexibility, in his refusal to compromise his intellectual integrity for career advancement. He wrote what he believed to be true, regardless of whether it would please potential patrons. He maintained his analytical clarity even when it cost him opportunities. In this sense, Machiavelli the man was less Machiavellian than the princes he advised, less willing to wear masks and play political games. Perhaps this is the final irony, that the great theorist of political manipulation was himself too honest, too committed to truth-telling, to succeed in the world he described so well. Yet his ultimate success came precisely from this commitment to truth. The career politician Niccolò Machiavelli is forgotten except by specialists in Italian history. But Machiavelli the writer, the thinker who insisted on describing politics as it really is, has influenced centuries of political thought and practice. His ideas spread far beyond Florence, beyond Italy, beyond his own time, shaping how we think about power and its proper uses. In losing his immediate political career, he gained a more enduring influence than any office could have provided. This suggests another lesson. The power of ideas, their ability to outlive their creators and continue shaping the world long after the immediate circumstances that inspired them have passed. Machiavelli's Florence is gone, destroyed by the very forces of foreign invasion and internal division he analyzed. The specific political situations he addressed no longer exist. Yet his insights into human nature, political behavior, the relationship between ethics and power remain relevant. Ideas, properly formulated and persuasively expressed, achieve a kind of immortality that no political office can provide. As we reflect on Machiavelli's legacy, we should also consider what has been lost or forgotten from his thought. His emphasis on civic participation and republican virtue, so prominent in the discourses, has often been overshadowed by the focus on the prince and its advice to rulers. His belief that ordinary citizens could be virtuous if properly educated and organized, that republics could be more stable and just than principalities, deserves more attention than it often receives. His military thought, his insistence that states need their own citizen armies rather than mercenaries, anticipated modern nationalism and its mass conscription. But it also contained idealistic elements, a faith in civic virtue, a belief that people would fight bravely for their own freedom, that contrast with his usually hard-headed realism. Perhaps Machiavelli was more idealistic than his reputation suggests, at least about the potential of republican citizenship. His literary talents, evident in his plays and letters, show a dimension of his personality that the political works alone do not reveal. He was not just a cold analyst but someone with humor, imagination, sensitivity to character and situation. His ability to create believable characters in his plays, to write letters that mix political analysis with personal warmth, suggests that his understanding of human nature came not just from observation but from genuine sympathy, from the ability to imagine himself into others' positions. This more complete picture of Machiavelli, republican idealist as well as realist counselor of princes, literary artist as well as political scientist, disappointed patriot as well as detached analyst, enriches our understanding of his thought. He was not a one-dimensional figure but a complex person living through difficult times, trying to make sense of a world in transition, seeking to understand how political order could be maintained when traditional certainties were collapsing. The Renaissance in which Machiavelli lived was itself a time of fundamental transformation, when the medieval world was giving way to something new. The unified Christendom of the Middle Ages, with its shared religious culture and its hierarchical social order, was fragmenting. The Protestant Reformation would soon split the Church. The age of exploration was opening up new worlds and new possibilities. The rise of gunpowder weapons was transforming warfare. Centralized monarchies were replacing feudal fragmentation. Everything seemed fluid, uncertain, pregnant with both danger and possibility. In such times, old answers no longer suffice. The political wisdom inherited from Aristotle and Augustine, developed for different circumstances, seemed inadequate for the challenges of the age. New thinking was required, new approaches that could grapple with a world where change rather than stability was the norm, where traditional authorities had lost their power to compel obedience, where force and cunning seemed more effective than legitimate authority. Machiavelli was not alone in this project of rethinking politics for a new age. Other Renaissance thinkers were also questioning inherited wisdom, returning to classical sources for inspiration, developing new methods of analysis. But Machiavelli went further than most in his willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions, to separate politics from ethics and theology, to insist on facts rather than ideals. This willingness to think radically, to follow arguments wherever they led regardless of whether the conclusions were comfortable or conventional, is perhaps Machiavelli's most important legacy. He demonstrated that political thought need not defer to religious authority, need not begin from moral axioms, need not pretend that reality conforms to our wishes. One could study politics scientifically, empirically, treating it as a natural phenomenon governed by regular patterns rather than as a branch of ethics or theology. This approach had profound implications, not just for political thought but for intellectual life generally. It exemplified the modern scientific attitude: observe, hypothesize, test, revise theories based on evidence rather than authority. Applied to politics, this method produced insights that traditional approaches had missed. But it also raised troubling questions about whether everything should be subject to this kind of analysis, whether some aspects of human life require different approaches, whether scientific detachment is always appropriate, or whether some subjects demand moral engagement. These questions remain unresolved, debated by philosophers and citizens to this day. We continue to argue about how much politics should be governed by moral principles versus pragmatic calculations, whether certain actions are absolutely wrong regardless of consequences or whether context always matters, how to balance ideals and realities. Machiavelli did not settle these debates. Indeed, he intensified them, but he made them inescapable, forced us to confront them directly rather than hiding behind comforting platitudes. In this sense, Machiavelli is quintessentially modern, one of the founders of the modern world with its separation of spheres, its scientific method, its emphasis on effectiveness rather than conformity to traditional norms. We are still living in the world Machiavelli helped create, still grappling with the questions he raised, still seeking the balance he never quite found between truth and useful belief, between is and ought, between virtue and fortuna. As we near the end of our journey through Machiavelli's life and thought, let us return to where we began, to Florence in the late 15th century, to that city of beauty and violence, of art and intrigue, that shaped the young Niccolò's understanding of political reality. Florence was a republic that was not quite a republic, ruled by wealthy families who maintained fictions of civic equality while exercising effective control. It was a center of culture and learning where assassinations happened in churches and political opponents were exiled or executed. It preached Christian virtue while practicing ruthless competition. This environment of contradiction and complexity, where appearance and reality diverged sharply, where power operated behind masks of legitimacy, where success required both intelligence and ruthlessness, this was Machiavelli's laboratory, the place where he learned the lessons he would later systematize in his writings. Florence taught him that politics was about power more than justice, about effectiveness more than virtue, about survival in a dangerous world rather than conformity to abstract ideals. But Florence also taught him about possibility, about what humans could create when they combined talent with will. The magnificent buildings, the sublime art, the intellectual ferment, all of this demonstrated what was possible when humans took their fate into their own hands rather than passively accepting traditional arrangements. The Renaissance was fundamentally optimistic about human potential, believing that people could reshape their world through skill and knowledge. Machiavelli absorbed this optimism even as he remained clear-eyed about human limitations and the persistence of fortune. This combination, realism about constraints, optimism about possibilities, characterizes Machiavelli's thought at its best. He does not deny that circumstances limit what we can achieve, that fortune plays a large role, that human nature is flawed. But neither does he counsel passive acceptance or resignation. There is always room for virtue, always opportunity for the skilled and determined to shape outcomes, always hope that present difficulties can be overcome through intelligence and will. This message had particular resonance for his own situation. Exiled from political life, his career apparently finished, he might have sunk into bitterness and despair. Instead, he channeled his energy into writing, into preserving and sharing the knowledge he had gained, into making his experience useful to others even if he could not use it himself. He demonstrated that even in apparent defeat, even when fortune has turned against us, we can still act meaningfully, still contribute, still leave something valuable behind. The image of Machiavelli in his study, wearing his formal robes, communing with the great minds of antiquity through their books, this is the image we should remember. Not the scheming counselor of wickedness that his detractors imagined, not the proto-totalitarian that some 20th century critics portrayed, but the serious thinker grappling honestly with difficult questions, trying to understand a complex world, seeking wisdom from whatever sources he could find. His study was not an ivory tower, not an escape from reality but a different way of engaging with it. Through reading and writing, through analysis and reflection, he continued to participate in political life even after being excluded from office. His books became his actions, his ideas his legacy. In this transformation from actor to observer, from practitioner to theorist, Machiavelli found a different kind of success, perhaps more enduring than the political career he had lost. There is comfort in this story for anyone who has faced setbacks or felt their talents wasted. Machiavelli shows that apparent failure can become the foundation for unexpected achievements, that losing one kind of success can open paths to another. His exile produced the works that made him immortal. His disappointments gave him the distance necessary for clear analysis. His loss of power freed him to tell truths that a man still seeking office might have been too cautious to speak. This suggests a final lesson from Machiavelli's life, the value of intellectual honesty, of saying what you believe to be true even when it is unpopular or dangerous. Machiavelli could have written works designed to flatter potential patrons, could have produced the conventional platitudes about virtue and justice that everyone claimed to believe. Instead, he wrote what he actually thought, what his experience had taught him, regardless of whether it would win him favor or employment. This intellectual courage was costly in the short term. His works were condemned, his reputation suffered, he never regained political office. But in the long term, this very honesty is what gives his work lasting value. We read Machiavelli today precisely because he told uncomfortable truths, because he refused to sugarcoat reality, because he had the courage to see clearly and report what he saw. In our own time, we need this kind of intellectual honesty perhaps more than ever. We live in an age of spin and propaganda, where facts are contested, where leaders routinely say things they know to be false, where appearance often matters more than substance. The temptation to believe comforting falsehoods, to accept pleasant lies rather than facing unpleasant truths, is always present. Machiavelli reminds us of the value of clear sight, of honest analysis, of refusing to let our wishes determine our beliefs. This does not mean embracing cynicism or nihilism, does not require us to believe that nothing matters or that all politicians are equally corrupt. It means being realistic about human nature and political constraints while still maintaining ideals and standards. It means acknowledging that good outcomes sometimes require morally ambiguous means while still insisting that ends do not justify any means, that some actions are beyond the pale regardless of their political utility. Finding this balance, between realism and idealism, between is and ought, between accommodating human weakness and demanding human excellence, is the perennial challenge of political thought and action. Machiavelli does not solve this problem for us, but he helps us think about it more clearly, strips away the comforting illusions that prevent us from seeing the dilemmas in their full difficulty. As we close this reflection on Machiavelli's life and thought, As our journey through Renaissance Florence and through the mind of its most famous political thinker comes to an end, we might pause to consider how he would view our own time, what he might say about our political challenges, what advice he might offer to contemporary leaders and citizens. He would probably be unsurprised by much of what he saw. Human nature has not changed since his time. People are still selfish, still short-sighted, still easily manipulated by those who understand psychology and propaganda. Leaders still face difficult choices between competing goods, still must sometimes use harsh methods to achieve beneficent ends. States still compete for power and resources, still use force and fraud to advance their interests. But he might also recognize genuinely new challenges. The scale of modern states, the destructive power of modern weapons, the speed of modern communications, the complexity of modern economies, all of these create situations that Renaissance political theory did not anticipate. Nuclear weapons make certain kinds of war unthinkable, not because leaders have become more moral but because the costs have become too catastrophic. Global economic interdependence creates constraints on state action that did not exist in Machiavelli's time. Democratic accountability, however imperfect, limits what leaders can do in ways that Renaissance princes never faced. Machiavelli might appreciate how modern democratic institutions channel conflict productively, create checks on power, give citizens stakes in good governance. He might see in constitutional democracy an attempt to realize the republican ideals he championed in the discourses while avoiding the chaos that often plagued Renaissance city-states. But he would also recognize the dangers, the way democratic politics can become paralyzed by partisanship, the way demagogues can manipulate voters, the way short-term election pressures can prevent necessary but unpopular policies. He would probably counsel modern leaders much as he counseled Renaissance princes: be realistic about human nature, learn from history, pay attention to military strength, maintain order through a mixture of consent and fear, appear virtuous even when necessity requires otherwise. He would remind citizens of their responsibilities, the need for vigilance against those who would undermine freedom, the importance of being willing to fight for one's city rather than relying on hired professionals. Most fundamentally, he would urge both leaders and citizens to see clearly, to not let ideology or wishful thinking blind them to reality. Whether one is more liberal or conservative, more idealistic or pragmatic, more focused on justice or security, clear sight is essential. We must understand how things actually work before we can change them for the better. We must acknowledge trade-offs and costs rather than pretending that all good things can be achieved simultaneously without sacrifice. This message of clear-sighted realism, of honest acknowledgement of difficulties and dilemmas, remains Machiavelli's most valuable legacy. In an age of propaganda and spin, of partisan echo chambers and comfortable illusions, we need his clarity, his refusal to accept comfortable lies, his insistence on seeing reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be. But we should also remember the other Machiavelli, the Republican, the patriot, the believer in civic virtue and human potential. He was not simply a cold analyst but someone who cared deeply about his city, who wanted Florence to be free and prosperous, who believed that ordinary people could rise to citizenship and virtue if given the opportunity. His realism was not an end in itself but a means to something better, a way of understanding obstacles so they could be overcome. This duality in Machiavelli's thought, the tough-minded analyst and the hopeful patriot, the student of how things are and the dreamer of how they might be, perhaps captures something essential about political wisdom itself. We need both perspectives, need to combine realistic assessment with noble aspiration. Neither alone is sufficient. Realism without ideals degenerates into cynicism and meaningless power-seeking. Idealism without realism becomes naive and ineffective, an exercise in wishful thinking that changes nothing. The conversation between these perspectives, the tension between them, the attempt to honor both while recognizing their conflicts, this is the permanent condition of political life. Machiavelli articulated this tension with unusual clarity, but he could not resolve it any more than anyone else can. We are left to struggle with it ourselves, in our own times and circumstances, making our own choices about when to compromise ideals for effectiveness and when to stand firm on principle regardless of cost. And so, as evening deepens and the shadows lengthen, as our time with Niccolò Machiavelli draws to a close, we leave him as we found him, in his study, wearing his formal robes, surrounded by books, conversing with the great minds of the past about the eternal questions of political life. He remains there still, in a sense, speaking to us across 5 centuries, offering his hard-won wisdom to anyone willing to listen. His message is not always comfortable, not always what we want to hear. But it has the ring of truth, the authority that comes from genuine experience and honest reflection. He asks us to be brave enough to see clearly, wise enough to learn from history, humble enough to acknowledge our limitations while still striving to transcend them. He reminds us that political life is difficult, full of tragic choices and unavoidable compromises, but that excellence is still possible, that we can still act nobly even in morally complex situations. Rest now, kind listener, let these thoughts settle gently into your mind like snow falling on a winter evening, each insight a small crystal of wisdom that will remain even after the details fade from memory. You have traveled far tonight, through the streets of Renaissance Florence, through the corridors of power and the chambers of the mind, through centuries of political thought and practice. You have met Niccolò Machiavelli not as the cardboard villain of legend but as a living, thinking person, flawed certainly, controversial undoubtedly, but also brilliant, courageous, and profoundly concerned with human flourishing and political order. His book, The Prince, remains what it has always been, a mirror held up to political reality, showing us things we might prefer not to see but cannot afford to ignore. It is not a complete guide to life or politics, not a final answer to our questions, but it is an honest and penetrating analysis of one dimension of political reality. Used wisely, with awareness of its limitations and dangers, Machiavelli's insights can help us navigate the difficult terrain of political life, can help us avoid naive mistakes while maintaining our moral bearings. The man who wrote the rules of power was himself in many ways powerless. Exiled from office, ignored by those he sought to advise, dying without seeing his dreams realized. Yet his powerlessness became a kind of power, his exile a vantage point for clearer vision, his disappointments the crucible that refined his thought to its essence. He could not shape political events directly, but he shaped how generations of people would think about those events, created categories and concepts that still structure our political understanding. This is the paradox and the promise of intellectual life, that thought can outlast action, that ideas can change the world more profoundly than armies, that a man writing alone in exile can influence history more than kings commanding thousands. Machiavelli the second chancellor is forgotten, Machiavelli the author lives on, his words still read, his ideas still debated, his influence still felt. Close your eyes now, and feel yourself drifting gently back through the centuries, leaving Renaissance Italy behind, returning to your own time and place. But carry with you something of what we have discovered together, the importance of seeing clearly, the value of learning from history, the necessity of balancing idealism with realism, the courage to face difficult truths without despair. These are Machiavelli's gifts to us, purchased at the cost of his own suffering and disappointment, preserved in prose that remains as fresh and challenging as when he first set pen to paper. The night deepens, the stars wheel overhead, and somewhere in the great continuum of human thought and aspiration, Niccolò Machiavelli still sits in his study, still converses with the ancients, still seeks to understand the nature of power and its proper uses. His work is unfinished, these questions admit no final answers, must be addressed anew by each generation. But he has given us tools, concepts, ways of thinking that make our task easier, that let us see a little further by standing on his shoulders. Sleep well, then, secure in the knowledge that wisdom accumulates across generations, that we are heirs to centuries of thought and struggle, that the questions we face, however difficult, have been faced before by others who left us their insights to guide our way. Machiavelli is one voice in this great conversation across time, not the only voice, not the final authority, but a voice worth hearing, an intelligence worth engaging, a mind that remains vital and challenging 500 years after his death. And so we leave him there in his study, dressed in his formal robes, books open before him, writing by candlelight words that will echo through the centuries. The candle burns low, the ink dries on the page, another day ends in the long story of human political endeavor. But the words remain, clear, sharp, uncompromising, inviting each new reader to grapple with the difficult truths they express, to think seriously about power and ethics, about effectiveness and virtue, about how we might build a better world while acknowledging honestly the obstacles and constraints we face. The prince sits on a shelf somewhere, waiting for the next curious mind to open its covers and encounter ideas that will shock, challenge, disturb, and ultimately enrich their understanding of political life. It is a dangerous book, certainly. Machiavelli himself knew that his ideas could be misused, could justify cruelty in the name of necessity. But it is also an honest book, refusing comfortable lies, insisting on reality however unpleasant that reality might be. And in this honesty lies its enduring value, its claim on our attention across the centuries. Machiavelli understood what many before and after him have preferred to deny, that politics exists in a realm of its own, with rules and necessities that do not always align with private morality or religious teaching. This does not make politics exempt from ethical judgment, but it does make that judgment more complex, more contextual, more attuned to consequences and trade-offs. The leader who refuses ever to use force will see innocents suffer when aggressors go unchecked. The leader who uses force too freely will become a tyrant. Finding the right balance, knowing when severity serves justice and when it becomes mere cruelty, requires practical wisdom that cannot be reduced to simple rules. This emphasis on practical wisdom, on judgment developed through experience and reflection, connects Machiavelli to the classical tradition even as he breaks with it in so many ways. Aristotle had taught that phronesis, practical wisdom, was essential for ethics and politics, that rules and principles could guide action but never replace the judgment of the wise person who understood how to apply them in particular circumstances. Machiavelli inherits this emphasis on judgment while transforming what counts as wise. The Aristotelian wise man acts according to virtue, while the Machiavellian wise man acts according to necessity, shaped by circumstances rather than eternal principles. Yet even this contrast is too simple, for Machiavelli does have principles, does believe some ways of acting are better than others, does distinguish between justified and unjustified uses of harsh methods. His principles are simply more flexible, more pragmatic, more focused on consequences than traditional ethics allowed. This consequentialism, this focus on outcomes rather than the intrinsic nature of actions, anticipates much modern moral philosophy, from utilitarianism to various forms of pragmatism. Machiavelli is, in this sense, one of the founders of modern ethics as well as modern political science. The question of whether consequentialism is adequate as a moral philosophy remains deeply contested. Can we really judge actions only by their results? What if the results are uncertain, as they always are in complex political situations? What if achieving good results requires systematically lying or breaking promises, undermining the very trust that makes social cooperation possible? What if focusing only on consequences ignores important moral considerations like respect for human dignity, rights that should not be violated regardless of benefits? These questions have occupied moral philosophers for centuries and remain unresolved. Machiavelli does not answer them definitively, perhaps no one can, but he makes clear why they matter, why we cannot simply retreat to comfortable platitudes about virtue always producing good results or good intentions being enough regardless of outcomes. Political life forces us to confront these dilemmas in their starkest form, and Machiavelli's unflinching willingness to examine them honestly is part of his enduring significance. There is also something deeply humanistic in Machiavelli's approach, despite the harsh conclusions he sometimes reaches. He takes human beings seriously, refuses to treat them as mere abstractions or vehicles for divine will. People are what they are, flawed, selfish, fearful, but also capable of courage, loyalty, and achievement when properly organized and led. Political theory must start from this reality, must design institutions and policies that work with human nature rather than requiring us to become something we are not. This realism about human nature connects to Machiavelli's republicanism in interesting ways. Republics, he argues in the discourses, succeed not by expecting citizens to be virtuous naturally, but by creating institutional structures that make virtue the path to success and honor. When citizens know that their welfare depends on the state's survival, when they have meaningful participation in decisions, when corruption is punished and public service rewarded, then even ordinary people will behave in ways that serve the common good. The key is institutional design, creating the right incentives and constraints. This insight has proven extraordinarily fruitful in modern political thought. The American founding fathers, particularly Madison, drew on Machiavelli's understanding that institutions could shape behavior, that constitutional design mattered as much as civic virtue. The separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, the federation of states, all these mechanisms aim to make ambition counteract ambition, to harness self-interest for public benefit, to prevent tyranny without requiring rulers or citizens to be angels. Modern economics has extended this insight even further, analyzing how market institutions, property rights, and regulatory structures can channel self-interested behavior towards socially beneficial outcomes. The invisible hand that Adam Smith described, by which individuals pursuing their own good inadvertently promote the public good, is a Machiavellian insight translated into economic theory. We need not change human nature, only design better institutions. Yet there are limits to this institutional optimism. Not everything can be solved by clever design. Some problems require genuine virtue, genuine commitment to principles beyond self-interest. Institutions themselves must be maintained, and maintaining them requires citizens who care about more than narrow private advantage. If everyone becomes thoroughly Machiavellian, if all trust dissolves into mutual suspicion, if no one ever acts from genuine conviction rather than calculated self-interest, then perhaps the institutional mechanisms themselves break down. This brings us back to the paradox at the heart of Machiavelli's thought. He describes a world of manipulation and power politics, but his descriptions assume that most people are not Machiavellian, that they can still be moved by appeals to virtue and justice, that appearances matter because people judge by them. If his analysis became universally accepted, if everyone understood politics as simply the pursuit of power by any necessary means, would his own prescriptions still work? Or would they become obsolete, unable to function in a world where no one believed anyone else's claims to virtue? Perhaps this is why Machiavelli's thought remains controversial, why each generation must grapple anew with his ideas rather than simply accepting or rejecting them. His analysis contains truths that cannot be ignored but also dangers that must be contained. We need his clear sight into power's mechanics, but we also need the moral traditions he challenged, need some commitment to principles beyond effectiveness, need some limits on what can be done in the name of political necessity. The synthesis we seek, the balance between Machiavellian realism and traditional moral constraints, perhaps cannot be achieved in theory but only in practice, in the concrete judgments of leaders and citizens who must act in specific situations. There is no formula, no algorithm that can tell us when harsh methods are justified and when they cross the line into unjustifiable cruelty. We must judge each case on its merits, weighing consequences and principles, acknowledging tragic choices while still maintaining moral standards. This irreducible role of judgment, of practical wisdom that cannot be fully codified or taught, is perhaps the deepest lesson we can draw from Machiavelli. Political life is an art, not a science in the narrow sense. It requires knowledge, certainly, knowledge of history, of human psychology, of institutional mechanics. But it also requires something beyond knowledge: character, courage, the ability to act decisively in uncertainty, the wisdom to know when rules should be followed and when they should be broken. Machiavelli possessed these qualities himself, at least intellectually. His career as a diplomat showed practical wisdom in action, his ability to analyze complex situations and offer sound advice to his superiors. His writings demonstrate remarkable insight into human behavior and political dynamics. If he never achieved the power of a prince himself, never became the redeemer of Italy he called for in the prince's final chapter, this may reflect more about fortune's role in human affairs than any lack of virtue on his part. Indeed, his failure to gain or keep power might be seen as validation of his own theories. He understood that fortune governs perhaps half of human affairs, that the best plans can be overturned by circumstances beyond control, that success requires not just skill but also luck. The timing of his career. The return of the Medici just as he reached the height of his influence, the suspicion he aroused in both Medici supporters and Republican zealots, reflected bad fortune more than bad judgment. Yet there may also be a kind of poetic justice in his fate. The man who taught that appearance matters more than reality, that princes should seem virtuous while being prepared to act otherwise, was himself perhaps too honest for his own good. He wrote what he truly thought rather than what would gain favor. He served faithfully rather than positioning himself cleverly. He chose intellectual integrity over political advantage. In this sense, he was not Machiavellian enough, not sufficiently willing to wear masks and manipulate appearances. But this very honesty, this refusal to practice fully the arts he described, may be what makes his thought valuable rather than simply dangerous. If Machiavelli had been a thoroughgoing cynic with no commitments beyond power, his analysis might be sharper but less trustworthy. We read him and struggle with his ideas precisely because we sense that he was trying to tell the truth as he saw it, that his analysis came from genuine observation rather than merely clever theorizing. This brings us to a final reflection on the relationship between truth and power in Machiavelli's life and thought. He sought truth about politics, wanted to understand how power actually works rather than how conventional morality claims it should work. This truth-seeking cost him power. His honest analysis was too disturbing for those who wielded power to embrace openly. His refusal to flatter cost him patronage and position. Yet in seeking truth rather than power, in choosing intellectual honesty over political advantage, Machiavelli achieved a different kind of power, the power of ideas, the influence of a mind that continues to shape how we think about politics centuries after his death. This suggests a profound irony, that the path to lasting influence may lie not in pursuing power directly but in pursuing truth, even when that truth challenges power and costs us immediate advantages. This lesson applies beyond politics to intellectual life generally. The thinker who tells people what they want to hear, who flatters the powerful and confirms conventional wisdom, may gain immediate rewards but will be forgotten when circumstances change. The thinker who challenges assumptions, who speaks uncomfortable truths, who analyzes reality honestly regardless of whether the conclusions are palatable, such a thinker may suffer in the short term but achieve lasting significance. Machiavelli embodied this principle, perhaps without fully intending to. He wrote The Prince hoping it would gain him employment with the Medici. It failed in that immediate purpose. Lorenzo de' Medici apparently paid little attention to the book dedicated to him. But by writing honestly rather than merely strategically, by analyzing power frankly rather than disguising his insights in conventional pieties, Machiavelli created something of enduring value, something that would far outlast the Medici regime and indeed all the political arrangements of his time. The great irony is that Machiavelli's honesty about deception, his frank discussion of when lying and manipulation are necessary, rests on a foundation of intellectual honesty that refuses to deceive his readers. He tells us that princes must sometimes lie, but he himself does not lie to us about this. He describes manipulation frankly rather than manipulating his readers. This transparency, this willingness to speak clearly about things that conventionally are not spoken of, is what gives his work its power and its shock value. Perhaps this is the ultimate Machiavellian lesson, that there is a kind of power in truth-telling, even when the truths told concern power itself and its often unsavory realities. By being honest about how politics works, even when that honesty is disturbing, Machiavelli empowers his readers to understand their world more clearly. And understanding, as Machiavelli knew, is the first step toward effective action. Let us imagine Machiavelli now, as the candles burn low in his study, as the night deepens toward dawn, putting down his pen after completing another page of analysis, another careful observation about human nature and political behavior. He has worked through the evening, has poured his experience and insight onto paper, has crafted sentences that will survive him and speak to generations yet unborn. He does not know this, of course, cannot know that his little book, rejected by the prince to whom it was dedicated, will become one of the most influential works in Western political thought. He knows only that he has tried to tell the truth as he understands it, tried to preserve the hard-won knowledge gained through years of diplomatic service, tried to make his experience useful even though he himself has been excluded from the practical politics he loved. There is a kind of heroism in this persistence, this refusal to let disappointment silence him, this transformation of personal failure into intellectual achievement. The study is quiet now, the books closed, the manuscripts carefully arranged. Outside, Florence sleeps, that beautiful, troubled city that shaped his understanding of political reality. Beyond Florence, Italy continues its struggles, continues to suffer from the foreign invasions and internal divisions that tormented Machiavelli. He cannot solve these problems, cannot unite Italy or drive out the barbarians, cannot do any of the great deeds he wrote about and admired. But he has done something perhaps equally important. He has understood, has analyzed, has explained in prose that will endure. And so we leave him there, this complex and controversial figure, this founder of modern political science, this clear-eyed analyst of power who was also a passionate patriot, this realist who dreamed of Italian liberation, this man who separated politics from ethics while pursuing both with deep seriousness. He sits in his study between two worlds, the medieval world that was passing away and the modern world that was being born. His thought partakes of both, carries forward ancient wisdom while pioneering new methods, honors traditional values while challenging conventional assumptions. The tension in his thought reflects the tension in his historical moment, the difficult transition from one age to another, from Christendom to the nation-state system, from feudalism to absolutism, from scholastic philosophy to Renaissance humanism and eventually to modern science. Machiavelli lived in the midst of this transformation, tried to make sense of it, sought principles that would remain valid even as everything else changed. His success was partial, some of his insights endure, others have been superseded, but his attempt was serious and his contribution substantial. As we take our leave of Niccolò Machiavelli, as our journey through his life and thought reaches its end, we might reflect once more on what he offers us, what we can carry away from this encounter across 5 centuries. Not simple answers, Machiavelli offers few of those. Not comfortable certainties. His analysis too often disturbs rather than reassures. But perhaps something more valuable, a willingness to see clearly, to think honestly, to face difficult truths without flinching. He teaches us to question authority, to look behind appearances, to ask not what people say but what they do, not what they claim to value but what they actually pursue. He teaches us that ideals matter but so do consequences, that good intentions are not enough, that the world is complex and often tragic, admitting no perfect solutions. He teaches us that power is real and must be understood on its own terms, not denied or wished away but grappled with honestly. But he also teaches us, perhaps inadvertently, that there is power in honesty itself, that intellectual courage has its own value, that pursuing truth even at personal cost is a noble endeavor. His life demonstrates that failure in conventional terms can be success in deeper ways, that influence outlasts office, that ideas matter as much as actions, perhaps more. These lessons remain relevant, perhaps increasingly so in our own troubled time. We too live in an age of transition and uncertainty, when old certainties dissolve and new arrangements have yet to crystallize. We too must navigate the gap between ideals and realities, must make difficult choices with imperfect information, must act in circumstances we cannot fully control. Machiavelli's wisdom, properly understood and carefully applied, can help us navigate these challenges while maintaining our moral bearings. The night is ending now, the first light of dawn touching the eastern sky, that ambiguous time between darkness and day when the world seems poised between possibilities. It was in such a time that Machiavelli wrote, in the twilight between medieval and modern, and perhaps it is in such times that his insights are most valuable, when old rules no longer seem to work but new ones have yet to be established, when we must think freshly about fundamental questions, when courage to see clearly is most needed and most rare. Rest now, dear listener, let your mind settle gently into sleep, let the ideas and images we have explored together find their place in your consciousness, sinking down like seeds that will germinate in their own time. You have accompanied me on a long journey through Renaissance Italy, through the corridors of political thought, through the complex mind of one of history's most influential and controversial thinkers. The journey has been demanding, has asked you to consider uncomfortable ideas and face difficult questions. But demanding journeys are often the most rewarding, the ones that change how we see the world and our place in it. Machiavelli waits there still, in his study, in his writings, in the continuing conversation about politics and power that each generation must join. His voice remains clear across the centuries, speaking truths that many would prefer to ignore but none can afford to dismiss. He is not the only voice we should hear, not the final authority on political life, but he is a voice worth engaging, a mind worth wrestling with, an intelligence that still has much to teach us. Sleep peacefully, then, knowing that you have touched something important, have engaged with ideas that matter, have spent these hours not merely passing time but deepening understanding. Tomorrow you will return to your ordinary life, to its routines and responsibilities, its pleasures and challenges. But perhaps you will see that life a little differently now, will notice the political dimensions of everyday interactions, will recognize the gap between appearance and reality in public affairs, will think more carefully about power and its proper uses. This is Machiavelli's gift to us, not a set of simple prescriptions but a framework for thinking, not comfortable answers but better questions, not moral certainty but intellectual clarity. It is a gift we should receive gratefully while also critically, embracing what is valuable while rejecting what is dangerous, learning from his insights while not accepting them uncritically. The candle has gone out now in Machiavelli's study. The manuscripts lie silent on the desk, their words frozen on the page, waiting for the next reader to animate them with attention and understanding. Outside, Florence awakens to another day, another chapter in its long history. And in studies and libraries around the world, people continue to read Machiavelli's words, to debate his ideas, to struggle with the questions he raised so powerfully. This is the immortality that writing offers, not the physical immortality of the body but the spiritual immortality of ideas, continuing to influence and inspire long after their author has returned to dust. Machiavelli achieved this immortality through clarity of thought and courage of expression, through refusing to accept comfortable falsehoods or conventional pieties, through trying always to see things as they are rather than as we wish them to be. And Southwest, we close our time together, our peaceful journey through history and ideas, our contemplation of one remarkable life and the thought it produced. The night gives way to morning, sleep to waking, study to action. But the insights we have gained remain, part of our mental furniture now, shaping how we understand the world even when we are not consciously thinking about them. May you carry these insights lightly but securely, like precious cargo carefully packed for a long journey. May they serve you well in navigating the complex political realities of your own life and time. May you combine Machiavelli's clear sight with moral commitment, his realism with idealism, his understanding of power with dedication to justice. This synthesis is not easy. Machiavelli himself never fully achieved it, but in the struggle to achieve it, in the honest attempt to see clearly while acting rightly, lies perhaps the best we can do in this imperfect world. Sleep now, and dream of Florence in its golden age, of marble palaces and Renaissance art, of political intrigue and intellectual ferment. Dream of a man in a study, writing by candlelight, preserving wisdom for posterity. Dream of how ideas travel across time, connecting us to the past while shaping the future. And wake tomorrow renewed, enriched by the journey we have taken together, ready to engage your own world with clearer sight and deeper understanding. The story of Machiavelli ends here, but the conversation he began continues. It continues in your mind now, in your reflections on what you have heard, in the questions you will ask and the judgments you will make. This is how wisdom is passed down through generations, not as dead knowledge to be memorized but as living thought to be engaged with, argued with, adapted to new circumstances. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time and ideas. Thank you for your patience with a long and complex story, your willingness to consider difficult questions, your openness to challenging ideas. May the wisdom of the past illuminate your path into the future. May you sleep peacefully and wake with renewed spirit. And may history continue to offer its gifts of understanding, perspective, and inspiration to all who seek them. Good night, kind listener. Until we meet again in another chapter of history's great story, rest well in the knowledge that you are part of that story, that your thoughts and actions matter, that the conversation about how we should live together in political communities continues in you as it has in countless others before. The book is closed, the candle extinguished, but the light of understanding burns on, passed from generation to generation, illuminating our way through the darkness. Rest now. The journey is complete. And in completing it, you have honored the memory of Niccolò Machiavelli, that complex, brilliant, troubling mind who dared to write the rules of power and in doing so, changed forever how we think about politics and human nature. His peace be with you, and may you find your own path between his harsh realism and the gentler ideals that also claim our allegiance. Sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful.